Welcome to the EarthWorks podcast, where our team will share the jargon of carbon from many of our turf friends from the past 30 years.
Hi, everybody. This is Joel Simmons, and this is another EarthWorks podcast. And I am once again very happy to have our friend Lawrence Mayhew back, our chemist, our brain trust. And Lawrence, like I've said to you, every time you come on here, you are one of the most requested guests. So we keep bringing you back, for goodness sake. So it's always good to have you here. And I'm going to preface this conversation by saying we were on our normal Monday morning call, and we do this, and I've shared this with folks listening a couple of times, that often on Mondays, the whole team, the agronomy team, will get together with Lawrence so that Lawrence can spin our brains and confuse us even more than we have been before. And we have, of course, been now beckoned to record all those because there's so much information going back and forth. And I got to say, Lawrence, I mean, every one of the guys on the team, every one of the agronomists, and now we have, Marshall, who's new, and he's heard it, and he just is overwhelmed by the depth of information. But it's great because the guys really want to learn. And so the other day, we started a conversation that we could have turned into a podcast, but it didn't quite record that way. We weren't quite professional enough on the call that we were doing to really make this a podcast. But I wanted to revisit it, and we did turn it into a very short 2-minute turf talk that is going to run this week as well. But we were talking about the use of some of these acids, and we were talking about the damage of bicarbonates. And I hope from the conversation you actually learned a few things on what we deal with on a regular basis when guys are dealing with bicarbonates. Kevin Hicks was on with us, and Kirk Kastner was on with us, and of course both of those guys are dealing with Western soils, and the Western soils in this country are very high in bicarbonates because their waters are very high in bicarbonates. And what happens is the bicarbonates seal the soil surface, and they become really the first limiting factor of what's going on in trying to grow quality turf. So it is a real issue. And one of the battles that is happening, or one of the products that is coming to fruition, that a lot of our team was concerned about, was some of these acids. Hydrochloric acid, hydrogen peroxide, combinations of those. And they've been very effective at removing bicarbonates. But the question we laid on your desk was, okay, these are effective, but we knew they would be caustic. We knew they would be pretty aggressive. And really the question ultimately for us, being soil biologists, is, okay, we're eliminating a big problem, but what are we doing to the damage of the soil with these things? So that's where that conversation was. And I want to revisit that with you. I want to hear that from you again, now that you're better versed as to what we were talking about. But it's a problem. I mean, and again, I'm not criticizing the use of products like this, hydrogen peroxide, or even hydrochloric acids or other acids. I'm sure there's other acids being used. But because a golf course superintendent or anybody managing a soil that is really laced with bicarbonates has to deal with the acute problem. And I think one of the analogies that Kevin Hicks made in the conversation that we had the other day was, it's like us using an antibiotic. If we're sick, we have an acute problem, an antibiotic can solve a lot of the problems. But as is with our bodies, the damage to the body, or to the soil in this case, can be pretty significant if we're doing this on a regular basis. So having said that, and I'm doing all the talking and I don't want to do that, just talk to me about what is the chemistry. So one of the things that we talked about the other day is that when we apply some of these products, you can actually see a fizzing effect. So first of all, let's talk about, what is that chemistry? What is actually happening when you're dealing with a bicarbonate and an acid and you see this little fizz? You're seeing a release of some chemistry. So it's all yours, my friend.
The chemistry behind that fizzing is the result of hydrogen protons exchanging for the carbonates that are on there and releasing carbon dioxide in the process. So it's essentially an acid-base reaction, pretty straightforward. And when acids and bases react with each other, there's always going to be some byproducts. In this case, it's carbon dioxide. It's a very rapid reaction if you use a strong acid. So it's very dramatic to watch.
Yeah.
If you put it on a soil, for example, that's high in bicarbonates, you can actually see the fizzing. So it's obviously something going on there, and it's the acid attacking a base.
So
Kind of
what's the fizzing? Is it
straightforward.
the carbon dioxide releasing? It's so you're creating carbon dioxide in the chemical reaction.
Right. The carbon dioxide is just very similar to shaking up a bottle of soda pop.
There you go.
You got it releases the carbon dioxide that builds up pressure if you don't take your thumb off. Yeah. So yeah,
Right.
you
Don't do
actually
that.
or if you pour a glass of beer, you can see those little bubbles
Yeah.
rising. That's carbon dioxide coming out of solution.
Champagne bubbles.
Yeah, carbon dioxide.
Yeah. So what we're doing is we're taking an HCl and reacting it with, and I said this the other day. I still don't remember what the HC30 or what is bicarbonates?
Yeah, you got an H in there plus the CO3.
The CO3,
Um,
HCO3. Okay, so you're
I think
basically reacting some of those out, turning it into carbon dioxide
yes.
and
And
releasing
if
it.
and if you apply HCl, which is hydrochloric acid,
Hmm.
the chlorine does not go away. It'll actually combine with the sodium that's been released. Then you end up with sodium chloride left behind in the soil.
So you have the potential of actually leaving a salt behind in this reaction.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I mean, so and again, I'll qualify this because I say this often, and I've said it many times on our podcast and in turf talks and in academies. I look at bicarbonates as perhaps being one of the biggest limiting factors in managing any turf, especially out west. The water is doused with it. So what it does is it seals the soil surface and air and water can't get through. And obviously what happens is if air and water can't get through, we're soil biologists. So we're biggest concern is keeping biology really active. So if this bicarbonate layer is sealing the surface, air and water can't get through, we're losing biology right at that thing. And it's, I'll tell you, I don't know if you and I have had this conversation. It's very strange. It can be very isolated. Bicarbonate can seal a soil surface and just give it a little spot, what we call a localized dry spot or LDS. And it could literally be the size of a softball or size maybe even of a golf ball. But it can be that isolated where that little sealing effect happens. And then, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression here is that what it's done is it's killed the biological activity underneath that sealing effect. No more air is going through there, and obviously everything living is going to need some oxygen. So that's what's happening with the bicarbonate. So it's imperative in these environments where a golf course superintendent or sports turf manager, anybody managing a soil, even I would assume this would even be prevalent in agricultural soils, that that removing this bicarbonate has to be one of the first things you do in order to move beyond that problem. So we're looking for solutions, but these acids can be pretty nasty. I mean, they can really, from a biological standpoint. And again, I want to say this very clearly. I'm not trying to criticize the use of these things because if I was a golf course superintendent, I would try to do anything I could to eliminate the problem, which is the bicarbonate seal. But as is true in anything, like I premised earlier, I take an antibiotic, I'm destroying all the beneficial bacteria in my gut. I want to try to come back, and a good doctor will tell you this, that get back into a probiotic. You had mentioned something that was interesting the other day. You had used the term prebiotic, and I don't know
Yeah.
that I was really even familiar with that. Help me understand that a little bit better.
The best example that I can think of as a prebiotic applied to soils, that is, rather than human health, is something that will house microbes and not break down in the process. And that would be humic substances are really expert at that sort of thing. They are prebiotic. A probiotic would be like a living organism that you add either to the soil or in the case of human health, you add it to your gut and you hope that that will proliferate. Well, that's a probiotic. So in other words, taking a progressive stance, trying to ward off disease problems by introducing a live organism. But they need a place to live. They need some place to do their work, and that would be on a prebiotic surface. Clays are a good example of prebiotics because there's a lot of interchange with organic matter in clays, and clays and humic substances are probably our most common prebiotics that we can use.
Would a probiotic, would an example of a probiotic be, and we use this term probably somewhat loosely, but we're constantly providing carbon sources solely for the purpose of feeding microbes. Can that loosely be considered a probiotic? I mean, it's trying to regenerate the population. Well, there you go.
No.
I've already been shot down. Thanks so much. Okay, folks, thanks so much. But all right, go ahead, explain that. I mean, you understand.
You said if you want to use a carbon source to feed microbes?
I'm trying to regenerate the population with, I mean, obviously we're going to come back with lots of available food sources. So the population that is there can regenerate quickly. Now, and that obviously does work, but that's not technically really considered a probiotic.
No, that's microbial food.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm trying to stretch the definition. If it's, hey, it's my show.
Glucose,
I can do whatever I want.
Yeah, if you added glucose or molasses.
Yeah.
We use molasses in almost all our products.
Right.
That is there to feed the microbial population, to give them a little boost, give them some energy. It's very usable. It's very immediate. Totally unlike a prebiotic, which would be just the opposite. The prebiotic would not be consumed. It would be the surfaces, for example, on which these interchanges occur.
Yeah, and humic acids or humic substances, I keep saying that in your presence, and I apologize, but humic substances are the perfect prebiotic because it is the housing unit. It's a structural thing. It's architecture. Biochar could be considered that, maybe not quite as chemically reactive as a humate, but these materials will help provide that protection, that housing, that coral reef. I like to use that as my analogy for fish that are trying to hide from bigger fish, or having a place to stay. So that would be a prebiotic. But in our scenario, what's a probiotic? What would be an example of probiotics? Bringing back microbes? I mean, actually inoculation?
Yeah. Right.
Okay.
There are a lot of products in the marketplace that are used to inoculate soils.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to predict what happens after that. It's kind of like, it's sort of like feeding the human population. You got some good humans, bad humans. They got a real mishmash of humans. Some will utilize it efficiency, some won't. Some will, so it's unpredictable at that point. And I was always taught by my mentors, let's create the conditions necessary for microbes to live rather than treat them with an inoculant. That's my background.
And mine. So, and you and I were mentored by the same, or much of the same person, Jerry Brunetti. And exactly. we never played that game until recently. And now we're dealing with two products, one of which you've been working with us on, which is BioVantage, which is a rhizobacteria inoculant, but we're also dealing with mycorrhizae materials and myco-replenish. So those are two good examples of ways to bring back living organisms from these soils. I mean, it's not unfamiliar. It's very similar to when a golf course superintendent might go in and fumigate, and we talk about going back and doing a probiotic approach, bringing back the environment with humates, and then providing some of these inoculants like the mycorrhizae, like rhizobacteria, and like you were saying, there's many products out on the market now that are starting to really realize that some of these things are really working. We've danced on this for a number of years because, again, our mentor, and particularly Jerry Brunetti, certainly taught me that it's better to build the environment, create that environment, bring in the humate so that the environment can really be enhanced, and then let the system happen. But we're dealing with these acute situations. So when we're dealing with something like hydrochloric acid being used to eliminate bicarbonates, or maybe even sodium. Hydrogen peroxide would be the same, I'm assuming. I mean, this is now becoming a popular approach. It's also doing an oxidation job on the soil.
Yeah, it oxidizes, right? Hydrogen peroxide, it's actually a reactive oxygen species, which are
You've
pretty
talked
harsh.
about that, but explain that again. Let's understand that a little bit better.
Oxygen that we breathe in the air is called diatomic. There's two oxygen atoms and they're connected to each other. And it's called it's now two atoms stuck together. O2, O with a subscript 2, is the oxygen that we breathe. If that can be broken apart, and a lot of systems break them apart, then they become more reactive at that point. And then their electrons are able to exchange with other electrons, other chemicals, so forth. But if you were to kind of supercharge that in a sense and add an extra oxygen to the O2, now you have an O3, which is extremely reactive, more like ozone.
Yeah.
And that is totally different. The reactive oxygen species are capable of oxidizing things much more rapidly than just plain old oxygen. So it makes them very, very reactive and makes them kind of caustic. The reason why we're concerned about ozone in the atmosphere being created by the old nasty freons that used to be released.
Yeah.
You want to throw your old refrigerator away, you just release the freon and throw it in the junkyard. We don't do that anymore because those freons react with oxygen up in the upper atmosphere, stratosphere, with ultraviolet light. That makes that a very highly reactive oxygen species. And that will go around breaking down other chemicals and combining the things that aren't really supposed to be there. So that was the main concern about ozone in our atmosphere.
Let me
Very,
have
very
you
similar.
qualify that term. Why is the word species involved in that term?
Sorry.
No, that's
Yeah.
not. I mean, you've said this many times, and I've had many questions on that. I wanted you to answer that question. Make sure I'm
Okay.
saying it right.
Okay. Let's take a non-species example. Bird.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. There's all kinds of birds out there.
Bird's not a
Well,
species. A
no, it's
blue
a
jay
genre.
is a species.
It's a
It's a
genre.
genre. Right.
Well, anyway, it'll do for now. We'll call it a genre for the sake of this argument. But if you see something in the backyard with an orange breast, what do you think that is? And it looks like a bird and walks like a bird.
It's a
Robin.
bird, maybe a robin.
It's a robin.
I
Now,
thought they
now
were
you're breaking
redbreast.
it. Now you're breaking that generalization of bird down into something a little more specific. You're calling it a robin. Now that robin has certain characteristics that other birds don't have. Okay, so in chemistry, if we have two things that are combined together to form a compound, uh, they're formed with what? If they're formed with a sulfate, for example, then we call that a sulfate species. Am I making sense here?
I think you are actually. Yeah. See, it's actually
Oh,
sinking in.
thank you.
This is pretty hard here. It's not. It doesn't come in very
Well,
easily.
let's use plain old
And
sodium, for
and
example.
and most of us that have ever gone through chemistry class probably hated it. So this is good.
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah, yeah. So
except for
let's pick
you.
on sodium. Sodium's pretty simple
Yeah.
molecule to deal with, or atom. And if we combine sodium with chloride, we have a certain species of chemical at that point. If we combine sodium with a sulfate, we have sodium sulfate. If we combine sodium with a carbonate, then we have sodium carbonate. All three of those are different species of sodium. The
Gotcha.
sodium is common to them all, like bird,
Right.
but what they're combined with creates a unique material compared to the other one. So then that's what we mean by species in
So
chemistry.
so a reactive oxygen species is a specific oxygen molecule that is reacting in a specific way.
It's oxygen that's highly reactive.
Highly
It's
reactive.
it's
Yeah.
in such a chemical state that it will readily combine with other things.
Yeah.
So it's oxidizing things that wouldn't normally be oxidized.
So when we're talking hydrogen peroxide, it's creating this very it's a very quick chemical reaction is what's happening.
Yes,
Now,
very.
how long lived is that? If we're putting down a hydrogen peroxide on a soil, that is laced with bicarbonates.
Mhm.
It's going to oxidize and break apart the bicarbonate. Is there any longevity to that? Is there any?
No, there isn't.
Okay.
No,
So it's an
no,
immediate reaction. You'll get
pretty
some
fast.
reaction. So is it, I mean, does it help what we're trying to accomplish here? We're trying to resolve this sealant.
Well,
It'll break
to a
it
degree,
quickly.
to a degree.
Yeah.
So if you added something to a soil to have an effect, and the effect was immediate, and you want to continue that effect, you have no choice but to put more on to
Right.
keep that going. So that's a huge drawback to using peroxides
Yeah.
for that purpose. So they will react, and they're very effective at that, but then they're done. There's just water left over, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you have oxygen boiling off because
Right.
it was so highly reactive.
Yeah.
You got some carbon dioxide coming off. So that's all okay, but it's very immediate, very short term.
Let's compare that to hydrogen or hydrochloric acid. So, what's the chemistry compared to hydrogen peroxide to hydrochloric acid in the same realm, dealing with bicarbonates? What's the chemistry of hydrochloric acid in this scenario?
Yeah, you have a hydrogen species that's very reactive, acid, connected to a chlorine, which is extremely reactive. And when the chlorine and when those two dissociate, in other words, when they break apart in water,
Mm-hmm.
then both of them are highly reactive. The chlorine is going to seek out something in that soil to react with. And if that's sodium, if it's calcium, magnesium, any of those cations can be combined with that chlor. Now it's a chloride. It's no longer chlorine.
Yeah.
Chlorine is a noxious gas that's, again, diatomic. There's two chlorines that make one chlorine molecule, but that's not the same as what we're talking about. We're talking about the reaction in water. And
Mm-hmm.
so you have a chloride with a highly negative charge on it, seeking to react with something. And it'll find sodium, it'll find magnesium, calcium, any cation that's in the soil system.
So,
In
would
the
the use of hydrochloric acid in this scenario affect the mineral content? Would it affect calcium? Would it affect other
Yeah.
minerals? How would it affect it, and what would it do? What would be the end result?
Well, it'll change the species of minerals
Here we
from
go again.
we're hoping to change the species of sodium
Yeah,
bicarbonate into sodium chloride,
right.
which hopefully can be flushed out.
Can move through the soil quickly. Yeah.
Yeah,
And that's
but
essentially what's happening, isn't it? When we're putting this acid down on a high bicarbonate soil, it's making that chemical reaction, and then some of it is actually leaching through fairly quickly. And it's oxidizing out the bicarbonates and reacting it to create the CO2 release.
what you have to realize is that chlorine is actually highly oxidative also.
Yeah.
So it is oxidizing things as well.
So you're getting a
So,
multiple effect. I mean, I mean, again, I think we're all in agreement that this process can be very effective. But let's talk about the damage of this. And again, I say this cautiously because I'm not saying this to be critical of the process. I'm really saying this because if this is the process that you're using, or if you're following a program like this to eliminate bicarbonates, we want to be able to talk about, the probiotic side of it. So what do we want to do to kind of compensate in a positive direction from using an approach like this to eliminate bicarbonates?
you have a product that's in development.
Well, we have a
And
couple of products already in the can, and I think we talked about that. I mean, one of
yeah,
the things
I revert back to that because this challenge was brought to me a couple of years ago. Hey, here's what's being used out
yeah,
there. Is there a better mousetrap? Nothing wrong with that thinking. Yeah,
yeah,
that what I would like to avoid in this process are the use of really harsh materials that end up putting salts in
yeah.
place of bicarbonates into the soil. And those salts, chlorine, especially chloride salts, are particularly damaging to microbiological systems.
And soil physical structure.
Yeah, and I apply that principle to everything.
Yeah,
I'm always trying to avoid chlorides at all cost.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
they're unavoidable, and we can try to balance them out in our formulations, but they're unavoidable. But to intentionally put a chloride in at high concentration, to me, is something I would never do. I mean, I just wouldn't do it. I'd be
Are,
looking for something better than
are those
that.
chlorides that are being now kind of created chemically in this process, are they leachable?
Most of them, yeah,
Okay.
chlorides on balance are leachable. Yes.
So, I mean, one practice would be to flush, would be to try to flush after an acid treatment to dissolve bicarbonates. A good flushing program would probably be the way to go. And one of the things that came out of our conversation the other day would be using, and again, I don't mean this to be exclusively EarthWorks because I'm sure there's a lot of good products, but we would use something like our K-Vantage product to replace some of the potassium. And you had talked about how potassium gets knocked around. And we would use C3 to help kind of rebuild some of the biological populations. As we're talking here, I think it might not be a bad idea as from a liquid standpoint, to bring in BioVantage, bring in a little probiotic. So the combination of those three as a rinse in or as a flush after the use of some of these bicarbonate removal acids, does that make sense? Is that a protocol that would help us accomplish what we're trying to find a solution for here, which is bringing back the good guys after we've kind of knocked out some of these bicarbonates? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I would start with an acid that's carbon based rather than a harsh
Yeah.
mineral based
Well,
acid.
sometimes we don't have that. That's a lot of the products out there are what are being used. So we're going to try to
Oh,
address
I
that.
see. Yeah.
But
So in
but
other
you're
words,
trying to suggest citric acid, I'm assuming, or some
oh,
other
citric
acid.
would be certainly a candidate.
Yeah.
Yes. Even formic acid would be a candidate. These are all
What's
real.
formic acid? I'm
Problem
not
with
even.
formic is it's not as complex as citric, so
Okay.
I would only use formic for acidification. I wouldn't use it for this purpose.
Yeah.
I would rather have something combined with a surfactant to get it down in the soil.
Right.
And in the case of citric acid, we can actually go through a series of proton releases, i.e. acids,
Yeah.
that have more of a buffering effect rather than an absolute acidic effect.
Yeah.
I'd follow that up with some fulvic acids to complex with the calcium, magnesium, and potassium cations that are left behind that would help displace the sodium cations from the soil colloids. That'd kind of be my design of it.
I think what's happening in the industry is that folks are trying to find a really fast solution. So that's where you're seeing the hydrochlorics, the hydrogen peroxide. So they're getting an immediate bang for their buck, if you will, on the removal of these bicarbonates, and they're starting to see air and water move through the soil. And I don't think we're going to make a change in that necessarily, and I'm not really even suggesting that we do. All I'm trying to suggest now is if that is the process that you're going through, what's the best way to recover from that? And that's where we came up with the idea of a flush or a rinse in with K-Vantage, C3, and maybe BioVantage as a probiotic. I guess that's really ultimately my question here. Is that gonna help us move in the right direction after some of these pretty caustic shots of material to try to resolve a very serious problem? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I would certainly think so. Yes. Mhm.
And obviously, I mean, we're, certainly here at EarthWorks, I mean, we're always, everything that we're doing for the most part has humic and fulvic acids in it, certainly all the liquids and most of the granulars. So we're creating that environment. So, I mean, just a strategy to eliminate some of these problems is to make sure that you've got a good biological foundation and you're promoting the environment by which biology can really proliferate. And again, that's been the backbone of what Jerry Brunetti taught us and what we've been preaching all these years at EarthWorks. So, there are some solutions to some of those problems. So, having said all of that, I'm going to move on to the other subject that you and I have started to talk about, which I find fascinating. And I talked to the agronomy team about this as well. And I'm going to show this. For those who aren't watching but listening, I'm holding up a book that I got from Acres USA, which is called When Weeds Talk, and it's by I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, but J.L. McCammon. And it's a fascinating. I mean, I look through this and it's fascinating. And I think I was telling you this story earlier. When I was a very young whippersnapper, and I think now I'm an old whippersnapper, but when I first met Jerry Bernetti, I was the county extension agent in Northampton County, Pennsylvania, which is the far eastern edge, eastern Pennsylvania, Lehigh Valley. Jerry, and I didn't know Jerry very well, but Jerry had taken me out with, and I don't even know who this person is. He took me out onto a farm visit with this gentleman who was an agronomist, and just spun my head. But one of the things that he took me out, and I mean, I gotta paint this picture. I'm just out of the university. I got all these degrees. I'm the smartest guy in the room. I mean, you could have asked me that. Luckily, I was completely humbled by my work with Jerry, and he brought me down to earth. But what this gentleman did was we were walking farm fields, and I remember walking down between two separate farmers' fields. And we're walking down in the lane between the two fields. On the right side was one population of weeds. On the left side was a completely different population of weeds. And he said, "Look at this. What do you see?" And I said, "Well, these guys, I think this was dandelions, plantains, foxtails. This was other weeds. I don't even remember what it was." And his immediate comment was, "This soil over here is radically different than this soil, and this is indicating certain things." And I was completely baffled by that. And of course, I was calling BS on the whole thing. And being the county agent, I had access to soil testing. So I soil tested. And everything he said was dead on. I mean, his soils were dead on. And what they're saying in this book is soils will promote the proliferation of certain types of weeds. I'll leave it to you to continue this conversation. I know this is not chemistry, but I know you've been around long enough. I find the subject fascinating, but it's prevalent in certainly in the golf course world. It's prevalent in home lawns. You've seen it at your house. I mean, I think you were telling me a story about stuff at your house just this morning.
Well, when you reflected back a
Yeah,
few years ago, I reflected back too when I first encountered this sort of thing. Gary Zimmer would go to these dealer meetings and present analysis for forage quality purposes. He would put up on the screen, look at how much calcium there is, look how much magnesium there is in this forage, look at potassium, look at the sugar levels, look at the fat levels, look at the digestibility numbers, and it would go on and on and on and on.
interesting.
And I'm sitting there thinking, these guys know more about cow nutrition than the average human knows about human nutrition. They're controlling everything, and they're being very, very, they're, how would you put it, particular about what goes in that cow's diet. And high quality forages drive the energy for milk production, so it really gets farmers' attention. So at one of the meetings, he throws this feed analysis up on the screen. It's very impressive, looks like an excellent forage. And then he breaks it to everybody. It's lamb's quarters.
Oh, wow. Oh,
He said, if you see lamb's quarters growing in your field, that's an indicator that that's a high calcium soil.
Yeah.
And that calcium is like the number one thing they promote when it comes to nutrition, even soil quality. So
Trying to get it into the animal, getting the
here
calcium
was
in.
something normally considered a weed
Yeah.
that had all the parameters to fit a high quality forage.
Yeah. So
That just shocked me.
I guess what this study is all about, and I know we're going to get some pushback from our friends in academia, and I'm sorry about that, Travis, but it's fascinating because you will actually be able to identify some deficiencies or excesses. I mean, as reading through this book, he's talking about some of the really common weeds in turf, things like dandelions, plantains, clover, foxtail. These are all calcium indicators, and it could be either high or low. It could be, if it's low, these are weeds that would come into the area for a couple of reasons. One might be because they have tap roots, like a dandelion does, to kind of compensate for the compaction that a imbalanced soil could be. Others are to replace more calcium into that soil, so as they break down and digest, they're adding calcium back for the next crop of plants. But it's fascinating because you can actually walk on, and I've in my career, I've done this probably thousands of times, walked on a property and I can see dandelions, plantains, clover, and you run a soil test, and sure enough, there's some serious calcium magnesium imbalances. And again,
Mhm.
I'm setting myself up for a lot of criticism here, but
Well,
I've
I'll
been,
take my turn at
yeah,
telling you
yeah,
the
please
story
do. But I've
about
been
my
seeing it for
backyard.
years, so I'll take the punch. I'll
Yeah.
take it again, and you can call me any name you want, Travis. I don't really care.
Well, when we first moved where we live now, 22 years ago, the backyard, oh, I should say the whole 20 acres,
Oh,
way back when was corn on corn on corn on
yeah,
corn,
yeah.
monoculture, monoculture. The soil all around our house was kind of a light yellow color, which means it's kaolinite dominated soil. The mineralogy is kaolinite, the clay, which is a
Hmm.
very low energy clay. So it's very, very difficult to raise anything under those conditions. But the dandelions and the plantain, they loved it.
Yeah, I
So I had a
bet.
backyard full of dandelions, and I finally gave up and brought in a load of sod and sodded it, thinking that might help. But
That'll get rid of these guys.
that reverted right back to what it
There you
used to
go.
be.
Pop right through that sod, and there you go again.
Yeah, now we're back to exactly what we had before after all that money being spent.
Yeah.
So
Go ahead.
I fixed the problem.
And how'd you
I
do
went
that?
out there and I put on some fairly heavy coats applications of your product C3.
Ah,
And
okay.
I said it says X number of ounces per 1,000 square feet. I was a little over that. And
Oops.
I just went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It was 2 years later that, and now there are no dandelions out there. There is no plantain. There was the clovers went away slowly, but I don't mind clovers
Slower,
in the
yeah.
lawn because they're
Yeah.
nitrogen fixing, and it's a beautiful lawn now in the backyard. But the only thing I think I did was stimulate the biological activities. So the root exudates were putting more carbon in the soil, and it just built up pretty much after that on its own. So
That's
that
interesting.
provided the conditions for good biology in that soil.
One of the first experiences I really had with this live was, and I've told this story many times as well because my stories are getting old now. But I was working with Tom Briner at Fiddler's Elbow Country Club in New Jersey. And his soils were very low in calcium, very high in magnesium, and he had clover everywhere. He was spending lots of money on spraying clover out. And over a period of about 3 to 5 years, we really started looking at soil tests and applying calcium. And one of the things that he came back to me and noticed very definitively and very quickly actually was that his clover sprays were less and less. We went from spraying 250-gallon tanks of clover control over the property down to spot treating clover with a backpack sprayer over a very large property. And again, it didn't happen overnight. It was 2 or 3 years, but this was
Yeah.
this was fairly
Mhm.
definitive. I mean, we were able to change the weed population as we were changing the soil. And I'm sure a lot of that, I mean, it's obviously a lot of chemistry, but it's also a lot of biology because we were also feeding that soil. So, and he talks about this in this When Weeds Talk book, and it's a fascinating study. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in there, and yeah, I'm sure it's not definitive. I'm certainly not suggesting to anybody that you're going to get rid of all your weeds by making some changes in the soil chemistry, but clearly there's something in here, right? I mean, we're seeing it all over regenerative agriculture. I've certainly seen it over my 30 some years firsthand. So there's got to be something in this, right?
It's all about the bugs.
Those bloody bugs again. That's always back to the bugs.
It's really, I mean, that's what we're shifting. We're not shifting the chemistry so
Yeah.
much. The chemistry in my backyard hasn't changed very much.
No.
But what I have changed is the profile that the normal biology that's there has probably changed dramatically because
Yeah.
it's visually different than before.
Yeah.
And by feeding it with C3, I didn't put any nitrogen on. Yeah,
Yeah.
I put on fish, right? That was the
Yeah.
probably number one
Some
thing.
kelp
And
and stuff
seawater,
like that. Yeah.
so you got fish and seawater concentrated, which is almost entirely what that product is. And it works. and it's not a high nitrogen application whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot more to it than that, but yeah,
Yeah, I'm
there's a
leaving
lot
a
of
few
goodies in
things
there.
out.
Yeah, a lot of secret sauce in there. You know, your
Yeah,
magic humates are in there. So I'm wondering how much
yeah.
the humate has control or has an impact on some of these definitives like we're talking about. Of
Again,
course.
providing the conditions for
Yeah.
microbiology. I didn't put humates on to shift the carbon. I didn't put
Right.
humates on there for any other purpose except to encourage a biologically balanced system rather than
Yeah.
putting on a chemical to try to control it, which is a losing proposition. In the long run, it's
Right.
expensive.
And it
The
kills
return is
microbes.
there. What's that?
And it kills microbes. I mean, these
Yeah,
herbicides can
yeah.
be. I mean, again, it goes back to what we started the conversation in this podcast is, these practices are there because we have to deal with acute problems. I mean, these environments that we're managing, need to be at the level that is expected. But we can always come back and continue to keep the soil happy and healthy, and
Mhm.
that's really what we're really trying to. And it's the same conversation we were having earlier. Hydrochloric acid is going to knock back microbiology. Pesticides are going to knock back biology. We're not criticizing the use of any of that. We're just suggesting that, hey, if we are going to use that, we've got to be able to come back in a positive gesture and make sure that the population of good guys are doing it. And that's what I think clients are seeing. I think that's what regenerative agriculture is seeing. I think that's where the industry is going. Is that yes, these materials are there to deal with an acute problem. But two things are happening. We're realizing that we can bring back biology, and in the process, we're actually reducing inputs. This example I had of Tom Briner using less clover control was because he got a cultural practice taken care of by getting the soil working for him as opposed to kind of working against him. And I mean, I saw it. He saw it. I've seen it thousands of times with clients all over the country in all sorts of weird soil environments. Every
Hmm.
soil is obviously a little bit different, but we followed it with soil tests, and something's happening. I don't know
Mhm.
what it is. Do you?
It's the bugs.
It goes back to the bugs.
It's always
Uh,
the bugs.
yeah, which what are what's actually happening? Give us the science of that. I mean, so what are the bugs actually doing that are really making these kind of changes? What's the actual science behind this? Since you're Mr. Science in our world.
Well, in the case of our products, we're applying materials that aren't necessarily highly soluble, and we're not applying them in large quantities. So just think about what you ate today at every meal. What was the most soluble thing in your meal? Salt, sugar? Aside
Probably.
from that,
Yeah.
aside from that, you were taking in amino acids, proteins, starches, and fats. You were taking in things that are essentially non-soluble. We're applying the same principles. Same thing. I mean, even your diet, for a normal person anyway,
Yeah.
reflects that. The soluble components of your diet should be really, really, really small. Why? Because if you increase that, it damages the bug population in your gut. And then you end up with things like diabetes or high blood pressure, something like that, which are all symptoms. They're not diseases. They're a
Right.
symptom of a system out of balance. So we're looking at it as a system. We're not saying, hey, you need this little component here and it's a magic bullet. No, we're saying, hey, look at this whole system. What does this whole system need to survive? That's a very difficult thing for academia to study
Yeah.
because
It's too
systems
big.
approaches are very
Yeah.
complex.
It's not reductionist. It's complex.
No.
It's
And
it's the
if you
opposite
want
of
to,
reductionist.
yeah, I suppose if you want to try to make a living doing that, you're laying out a very complex future for yourself if you're going to study that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's
With so
hard to.
many variables, you can't even figure out which one
Yeah.
is actually impacting it.
I mean, and that's it's the dynamics of a biological environment. It's very hard to definitively say this is the silver bullet. There is no silver bullet in
Nope,
in
there aren't
systems.
any.
And that word, I've heard that word my entire professional career because that's a word that our friend Jerry Bernetti constantly used was it's a systems approach. He's constantly looking at system. And the best
Mhm.
example of that, and this was again something he taught me early on, Jerry would go into a farm, and you've done the same thing, I know. It would go into a farm because a cow was sick or down, and he would look at the acute problem of the cow, and then he would go right back to the very beginning and look at the soil test.
Soil.
And and the farmer would look at him with this weird look on him. Well, I mean, we're talking about Bessie who's sick. I mean, what are you talking about, soil test? But it's that whole systems approach. The cows eating forage that came off of a soil that may or may not have had a balance of mineral, and the forage wasn't getting what it should have gotten. The cow wasn't getting what it wasn't getting, so therefore the cow is sick. Unfortunately, in our world with turf grass, we don't have the cow. We don't have that really good indicator, but you can certainly see the weakness within the forage. In this case, our grass. But yeah, that's the systems approach, right?
Yeah, and one of the giants in regenerative agriculture is Gary Zimmer.
Yeah,
And Gary Zimmer is a formerly trained dairy nutritionist.
as was Jerry Brunetti. Yeah, and that's
And
why
has
they were such good
and
friends.
both of those guys ended up working on soils because they saw the connection.
Yeah,
And it's a
yeah.
systems approach.
Yeah, and I think that's important, and that's really what I think that's where our industry is going. Certainly, EarthWorks has done that, and we're certainly seeing a lot of people having that conversation. But what's important to understand is that it is a system, and it's not linear. I've used this term many times. Jerry used to really preach it from the mountaintop. We're not dealing with linear stuff. That's why the formulas that you and I are working on together, there's nothing linear about it. I mean, I've shared this story before. We were working with a linear kelp product at one point, and it was the only time in my professional career that I really got pummeled by Jerry, and it was shocking. I mean, he had a temper, but he usually didn't use it on me. This day he did. And it was because I was trying to sell a linear thing, and so I said, "Okay, Uncle," and I said, help me with this. And he literally took a notepad that looked like this and scratched out what is still our working formula to a great extent of C3. And it
What
is hands
oh,
down
sorry.
the best thing that we've made.
What I was impressed, well, in 2015, when I was invited to take over Jerry's formulations, number one thing, it was shocking to see how
Yeah.
complex
Yeah.
they were. And I couldn't even begin to
I
grasp.
tried to warn you on that, but that's why I
Yeah,
told you,
well,
because I knew I needed your help. It was over my head.
but what I discovered was, see, I came out of the ag world where you use dry,
Yeah.
solid inputs, and you don't have a lot of control over what goes in that soil. You
No.
take a shot at it. You use this product over here, or this ingredient, or this mineral, and this and that, and you try to come up with something that you think is balanced. The beauty of these liquid formulations is you can dial them in.
Yeah.
You can hit targets, you can hit ecological targets. And when I started appreciating that control, then I began to sort of understand what was going on there. And then I started analyzing those formulations in terms of what is their elemental makeup and the species of whatever he picked to carry that mineral through. And that's when I started to sort of understand them.
Yeah.
But
I mean, it's funny working with you and having worked with Jerry for 30 years, and seeing the different approaches that the two of you made. I mean, Jerry was just incredibly intuitive, but you've really broken it down more into a really chemical approach. And it's interesting to see that approach to somebody's intuitive understanding as to what these formulas are. And I'm sure you've learned a tremendous amount just studying what he was doing.
tremendous. Yeah,
Yeah,
tremendous. To me, it's a biochemical approach. To
it
me, it's
is.
like Jerry's book says it right there. It's geology and biology
Yeah.
that he's looking at, and chemistry. So it's actually a geomicrobiological approach. Now we're talking very complex systems.
Yeah. We did this once, and I think we should get our guys together and break down his book. I mean, you and I did that for Agrodynamics, his company,
Yeah.
and it was fascinating. I mean, I've read the book. I was one of the first to read the book, and I've shared that story, but I've read his book a number of times. But when we broke that book down chapter by chapter, it really was enlightening, and it might not be a bad podcast series for us to do at some point, is to take his book chapter by chapter. And we have a number of clients that have, it's a hard book to read. I mean, that. I mean, it's very complex. It can be a real challenge to read. But if you really are into that kind of stuff, his book called Eco Farming, is really fascinating. And when you break it down chapter by chapter, and you saw the way he's thinking and the way he puts everything together in his head, it was fascinating. But that was a great experience in my world. I'm sure you remember when we did that with those folks. It was kind of cool.
It's a ecosystem look at
Yeah,
what goes on in the farm.
yeah,
Yeah, I agree. It was different in its day, and it laid a
yeah.
lot of groundwork for people to build on after that.
Yeah. And I think you know this. I think I've talked to you about it, but Fred Walters told me right after I interviewed him for this podcast that Jerry had a second book that was 90% done. I'm like, what are you
Yeah,
talking?
yeah, you
Fred,
told
come
me
on,
that.
let's get this thing out. So I talked to Jerry's son. I'm going to continue to pursue that. And if you're watching, Fred, I'm going to make sure we get that book published, because anything that Jerry Brunetti put out, it's still probably 10 years ahead of its time. And when you started looking at these formulas, I mean, I kind of grew up with them professionally, and I'm not the chemist or the biologist that you're, the geobiologist, or the intuitiveness that Jerry was, but I understood, the complexity of them. And it's
Mhm.
fascinating to me. But, it goes back to, and I want to kind of full circle this. It goes back to what we're talking about with anybody in any agricultural environment, be turf grass or corn or wheat or whatever you're doing. I mean, yes, we are an industry that relies often on chemistries that allow us to deal with acute problems. And I'm not here to suggest that that's good or bad. But what I am going to suggest, and I think what Jerry was really adamant about, was we have ways in which we can really soften the blow, if you will. I mean, yes, these are products like hydrochloric acid or a pesticide. These are products that are used, and it is what it is. But we can come back and we can really make that impact much less from a negative standpoint by just simply, creating an environment in the soil and building that systems approach, letting the biology come back. The tools that we've built, lots of other companies are now building tools much like ours. But I hope what everybody understands is that the reason why we do this is because we are trying to create that systems approach. We are trying to make sure that biology and Mother Nature is really at the forefront. And when we do have to take an antibiotic, and I love the human health analogy, the body can recover from it much more effectively, quicker, and without long-term permanent damage. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I've read a number of papers that indicate that nitrogen application is always over applied.
Yeah.
And once these systems stop getting abused by over application of nitrogen, just walk away from them, they heal.
They come back. Yeah.
They
It's
come
funny
back.
you say that, because we've been doing this podcast now since the beginning of COVID, some 4 years. And there's definitely a trend in the turf industry of superintendents who are playing the game of reducing nitrogen. And I think they're doing it because, they see the value of what lower usage of nitrogen. I mean, when I got into this industry in the late 80s, early 90s, nitrogen was being used extensively, 4, 5, 6, 10 pounds of nitrogen a year. And I think what superintendents are just discovering on their own is the value of using less. And then when you start to bring into this picture some of these carbon amendments, and you allow microbiology to release the nitrogen, they know they can get away with less, and they see less damage. So exactly what you just said, I think, is coming to fruition just simply by discovery. And what we're hoping to be able to do is just help people take it to that next level, which is really the systems approach, right?
Right. And oddly enough, in the year 2015, for the first time in the history of the Earth, the amount of nitrogen applied, synthetic nitrogen applied to soils exceeded natural nitrogen fixation by microbes for the first time in history.
Really?
Yeah.
How'd they come up with
And
that statistic? Or who did?
oh my gosh, that was a very complicated paper I can
I bet.
reference for you sometime. Yeah.
Has it reverted back since then? I mean, is it are
No,
we
no. The ratio of applied nitrogen to the amount of nitrogen taken up by plants has actually been declining since 1980. There is less bioavailable nitrogen now than there was in the past, and humanity has exceeded the planetary boundary for nitrogen availability.
Well, maybe that's our
Yeah.
goal as we age out, Lawrence. And I can say comfortably that, I'm confident that at least in our little world, we're certainly helping people reduce nitrogen usage, and it's only a good thing. And what we're doing is we're reverting it back to bioavailable nitrogen, and what we mean by that is let the microbes do. I mean, they're pooping out ammonium. They're giving you free nitrogen, in the process of regenerating themselves. So I'm going to leave this podcast on that note because we've run out
Okay.
of time. And I wasn't even planning on going a full hour, and I am
All
grateful
right.
for your time. And
I just looked up the reference.
oh, please. Okay. I'm listening.
CJ Stevens, 2019 in Science, the publication Science, volume 363, 6427. And
And you just happen to have that on your desk? Is that
I'm looking at it. Yeah.
all right? Now that creeps me out a little bit, but I love it. It's great.
No, it shouldn't.
That's very Lawrence in my
I'm
world.
working on my acres presentation.
Let's talk about that. You're going to be a speaker, and if folks haven't been to an Acres USA conference, and for those who don't know Acres USA, they're really the voice, as they claim, and here is a copy of their magazine. It's a wonderful publication. Always, I get this, printed, and I read it often. I'm always enthralled. I love their conference. I mean, it's regenerative agriculture, but I have been there many times, and I have seen many golf course superintendents. Our dear friend and agronomist Kevin Hicks has been to Acres a number of times as a golf course superintendent. And Lawrence is speaking this year at Acres, which I'm thrilled. Bill McKibben has spoken there many times. Jerry Bernetti used to be one of the keynotes. I myself have spoken there a number of times. In fact, Chuck Walters introduced me once as the first person that he ever met that actually talked base saturation at a university level, which of course has gotten me into a tremendous amount of trouble because we all know base saturation is just snake oil, and we're trying to sell
It just goes back to 1939. That's all.
Yeah, I know, but that's what Travis likes to tell everybody, is that I'm a con artist who's trying to sell them bad things like limestone. Oh my goodness, limestone. And
You want to know the title of the presentation?
yes, that was my next question.
Oh, okay.
Is this going to get me in trouble? Go ahead.
What?
I'm going to probably get me in trouble.
Biological carbon-based fertilizers.
Wow, I'm impressed. I might have to go to that.
Yeah, please do.
Or send me the what day is it? What day are you on? Do you know that? You're going to Thursday, right?
It's Thursday, the second day.
Okay.
December 5, I believe it is.
I'm planning on being there, so I'm going to hopefully see you speak on carbon-based fertilizers, even though it's probably heresy, but that's all right. We'll live with it. Lawrence, thank you so much. As always,
You're welcome.
I couldn't do it without you. Like I said, we get a lot of feedback when you get on here, and I apologize for the rambling, and I probably spoke too much, but I always do. But having your insight and the breath of fresh air that comes from listening to you is always good. So I appreciate your time as always. And if you have not signed up for the EarthWorks podcast, please do. We will tell you when people like Lawrence Mayhew will be coming back to the podcast. So Lawrence, enjoy the rest of your day. Have a wonderful time. I look forward to seeing you at Acres.